and thanks to all of you for coming to my talk. So my name is Mayank Goel. As Michael said, I'm a faculty member at CMU. And today I'll talk about a bit of our work in this broadly sort of described title here, 1 billion medical devices. Really, it's more than 1 billion devices at this point because we are using like smartphones and watches and other sort of consumer devices that we have with us. And I'll focus more within that area on using far from perfect machine learning in healthcare and far from perfect sensing and machine learning in healthcare, because there are a lot of limitations that we have in terms of sensing, machine learning, use of AI, but we want to make sure that we can figure out ways to support users in maintaining better health while using these technologies, because we can't wait for them to get perfect, because that might not ever happen. This is the most significant bit that I wanted to cover, that you know who I am, you know my lab name, you know the title of the slide. So I'm not too worried whether I get through all of my slides or not. So if you have any questions at any point, just ask. We don't need to worry about time. So, keeping people healthy at home. Why is that needed? It turns out that we are living longer. The average life expectancy has increased. But at the same time, we are living with more illnesses. We go to doctors whenever we are ill, but we also manage our illnesses at home between those visits to the doctor. And the doctor is also not always there. The access to healthcare is limited wherever we go. The magnitude of limit to the doctor is going to be different in different contexts, in different countries. And COVID was definitely sort of one phenomena that happened that stress tested the health systems across the globe. Did not matter how rich you are, what part of the world you are in, everyone felt some lack of healthcare at that point. So this photo is from the Delta wave of COVID-19 from India, where most of my family is. And during this wave, at one point, everyone in my family got COVID. My mom, everyone recovered. My mom was the one who was affected the most and became very sick. And at one point, she was in ICU for 3-4 days. But before she was in ICU, and this was like everyone in my family, my brother, his wife, my dad, mom, everyone had COVID. And the doctor said, keep track of her breathing rate. If her breathing rate goes above 20 breaths per minute, then bring her to the hospital, because the hospitals were insanely inundated with patients as well. So the doctors wanted to be a bit more strategic and who comes to the hospital and who not. So 20 breaths per minute was sort of the threshold that the doctors gave. And that is hard for you to keep track of, especially when you are sick as well with COVID. But my father and my brother, they all lived together. They were able to make it work during the daytime. At night, they could not, because they had to sleep as well. They were recovering from an illness as well. I was here in the US, in Pittsburgh. The time zone difference meant that at night, I could observe her. But I had to manually do it. So initially, it started as a FaceTime call that my dad would start the call on a laptop that my brother had, would align the camera to sort of like, where my mom was sleeping, and I'll keep an eye. But it became tedious. I had done a lot of work on health sensing until then. In fact, I had a paper on using wireless routers for measuring breathing rate 5 years before my mom needed it, but I still did not have it. Because, when we write a paper on something and what is really usable and deployable in a person's life, there is a big gap there. So around that time, I was teaching a course on sensing and machine learning, and one of the homeworks that students do in that class is using cameras for measuring heart rate. While I was doing that, I realized that, wait, this algorithm that we are using here can be used to detect breathing as well. So I'll show you a quick video of that system in action. That's an angry looking me. It's just angry looking. I'm not really angry. I'm just anxious about whether the video I wanted to record, I'll be able to record or not. So apart from that angry me, you see some dots in this video. This is the output of optical flow algorithm. Many of you might be aware of it, but for those of us who do not, it's an algorithm that basically tracks motion in different parts of a video. So those small lines or dots that you see, as I'll move around in this video, you will see these lines moving around. So they move with me, right? As I move from left to right, they move left to right. I move up and down, they move up and down. Now, if I add just simple addition of the vector of each of these dots and lines that I have into a single stream, I can track the direction and the amount of motion in this video. Oh, I started looking there. So here, you see a person sleeping, and that white squiggly that we see in the middle is just a simple addition with very basic filtering on top of that, is basically the breathing rate of that person. And this is like 15 lines of code that can run on a browser. So I basically gave this small web app to my dad. He ran it on that laptop, and I was able to keep track of my mom's breathing rate when she had COVID for those 3 days. It worked like a charm. But why did it work like a charm? Who's the user here? Who do you think is the user?
I mean, you have experience with technologies, so you know that the little ones don't matter. It's the big ones, but somebody who hasn't looked at a graph in 40 years would have no idea what to do with that.
Yeah, so I'm the user, right? I'm the expert here who's able to use it. So yeah, I'm the user. And you are right, I'm the expert as well. But I'm also rich. By Pittsburgh standards, I don't think I'm rich by California standards. I'm also motivated because it's my mom's health online here. I'm trained to use, and as you said, I'm trained to build these systems as well. And I'm invested for a short time. I used it for 3 days. If I had to use it for months, I would get tired as well. I would figure out ways to support myself. So it worked for me because I'm an expert user. But one of the ethos of HCI, especially at CMU, is that the user is not like me. The average user is not going to be rich, motivated, trained to build, trained to use this system. So as we want to build these smart end-to-end health systems, we need to make sure that we sense things in a way that are explainable. Like in that video, I was using a camera. It was not like a Wi-Fi router that is trying to measure breathing rate that an untrained user would not know what to do. If I tell someone who does not know computer vision that I'm trying to measure something with a camera and they can look at the output of the camera, it would be obvious to them that, okay, you have to align the camera somehow. You have to make sure it's not occluded. No one comes in front of it. The lighting conditions are there. There are things that we would know because the camera is mimicking human senses. So we try to make sure, in many cases, that the sensing we use is explainable to the untrained user. It won't always be accurate. The machine learning won't be accurate. So when needed, we'll need to seek user input. The information that the system generates should be actionable and useful for the user, because then only they will provide you the input. They will give you their interest and time and attention. And while doing all of that, of course, we need to make sure that we keep the burden on the user as low as possible. And we try to make sure that we do these things across this end-to-end spectrum of health sensing. So in my group, we build techniques to measure health outcomes, physiology, behavior, etc. We figure out ways to effectively share that information with the patient, their family members, caregivers. We also figure out ways to explain whatever we have measured to all the stakeholders, and then ultimately try to figure out strategies to help them as well to take care of themselves and their patients. So I'll show you some examples of some of the work that we have done in this area. So I'll start with this idea of explainable measurements, and I'll go back to the breathing rate detection example. Here, instead of using a regular camera, we are using a thermal camera, because the regular camera could give us how the body is moving, and from that we could extract breathing rate, but it doesn't always work, because it works when someone is sleeping and there is very few other sources of motion. But in daily life, it'll be hard. If I had a camera right now that had to monitor my breathing rate right now, it'll be hard because I'm talking, I'm also moving. So the thermal camera is much better at that. So if you see at that video there, you can see the color of the nostril changing. That's when we breathe in, there is evaporation that happens around nostrils and lips that the camera can pick up. when we exhale, the air that is exhaled out is usually going to be a bit warmer, so we can pick that up as well. So with that information, we can really very reliably start extracting breathing rate. And in this case, the video was recorded when the camera was placed on a treadmill and a stationary bike, and we were looking at a person's nose as they were exercising. So the first thing we tried to do with this information was actually to figure out how many calories does someone burn when they are exercising. And the reason for that is the smartwatches that we regularly use to figure out how many calories we have burned are very, very inaccurate. How many of you have ever seen the number that shows up on our watches or phones on how many calories do we burn? I see a few hand raises. Does anyone know how inaccurate they are? They are very inaccurate. They are almost 40% inaccurate. We compared that to a clinical device that I had to almost smuggle from somewhere because I'm not allowed to buy those devices, and CMU could not figure out a way on time. So we compared that to a smartwatch. We got around 50 participants to come and exercise on these machines, and we sort of look at the number, and it was around 40% inaccurate. In comparison, when you add the breathing rate information, that error goes down to 5%. And the reason is the clinical device looks at three things: heart rate, breathing rate, and the concentration of oxygen left in the exhaled air, because our body used some of the oxygen, converted that to carbon dioxide, but it's not pure carbon dioxide that come out. The thermal camera would not give us that part. That's why there is still some error that is left, but a lot of it goes away. That was one application we sort of built on top of this thermal imaging way of measuring respiration, but we took it further. And one of the things that I had done in the past using the wireless routers approach was to look at sleep apnea and look at breathing rate detection there.
I'm kind of curious, so I know that the Apple Watch has some sort of a measure of respiratory rate, I think. I imagine it's super inaccurate, but I think that the user friendliness of the Apple Watch, so I don't have to have a camera on me all the time. Do you have any thoughts about the efficacy versus burden on the user trade-off with these kinds of systems?
Yeah, that's a great question. I do not think it would make sense in its current form for a thermal sensing-based approach to be on a smartwatch or even on a smartphone. We connected it to a smartphone because it was easy to connect a thermal camera accessory to that. I really think the work that I showed there makes sense to be as part of our bike computers by Garmin and these companies, and on treadmills. So I think that is a use case, because then it is looking at you all the time. Beyond that, we just need to know that our smartwatches at this point are 40% inaccurate, and we just whatever number we see, we just subtract some out of that. But yes, I think we are not at that deployable level yet. So we looked at sleep apnea because if any one of you have ever been to a sleep clinic, I actually spent a couple of nights there because we wanted to see how bad the system looks right now. But they connect you to these hundreds of wires, and then you sleep. The signals the doctors get from this is very useful, but it is very inconvenient for the patients. But if you have to do it for a night or two in a year, it's fine. The challenge is, in many places, the access to sleep clinics is very, very bad. For example, we are right now collecting some data in India, in New Delhi, and the hospital we are working with is one of the biggest hospitals in the world. They get patients from all around the country, and the wait time, I'm not making this up, for that sleep clinic is more than a year. So it is really hard. The access to this information is really low, and you can get devices that you can sort of do it at home, but then they are also expensive, inaccurate, and also, as you can see, not very comfortable. So instead of that, what we are right now doing is we have collected data from around 200 patients where we give them a thermal camera. Right now, all of this is happening in the sleep clinic because we want synchronized information from the clinical devices as well. But you can sort of while they are sleeping, you can see the same kind of signal that I showed in the previous video. But because we are using thermal imaging, it's something we can do beyond just the nostrils as well. So we don't always just sleep like this, right? And the camera can keep looking at us. We twist and turn. When we do that, the reflected signal, you can actually see it on the pillow. And if someone covers their face with a blanket, as long as it's a thin enough blanket, you can see the reflections on that blanket as well. So by combining this information, with the motion information, because the motion information is still useful, we can make a very accurate estimator of sleep apnea. Not as accurate as the clinical device, but much more accurate than the existing devices that people may use at home. So here I have a bit of one example signal that we have. So the top signal that you see, the x-axis is time, so the signals are changing over time, is the nostril airflow. And the bottom one is the chest movement. So what you can see is that when someone had a sleep apnea event, their chest is still moving, but the air is not coming out of the nostrils. Because they are trying to push the air out, but there is some restriction that is not allowing the air to come out. This is something the doctors want to detect. But if you use an approach that only uses motion sensing, you won't get that. So the multimodal approach allows us to do that. And the promise of that meant that we were able to record all of this data. And we are still getting like 2 patients every night data from this hospital in New Delhi in India. So this is sort of the first example of the things that I wanted to show you today on this end-to-end spectrum.
How does that differ from like the prior work on it? Are they only using
They're only using motion.
video, or now like the one, I guess she was a UW student, who's now Cornell Tech, like different?
Yeah, so they are Wi-Fi-based approaches. All they are able to look at is how the body is moving. You don't get information of the nostril airflow. So you can combine that. And the other challenge is because the way you are sensing is much more impressive when you are able to use Wi-Fi routers. But the challenge is that it's a very indirect approach. When it doesn't work, you don't know why is it not working. So oftentimes, those systems only work when the person is absolutely still. If there is any motion, you don't know what happened. And if you have multiple people sleeping in the room, it becomes very confused. People are able to sort of beamform those Wi-Fi signals and say, I'll only look at the left side of the bed. But imagine using something like this for small kids. I have 2 kids, they sleep together on a big bed. They sleep in one arrangement, in the morning they are in the different arrangement, right? So an indirect approach would not be able to detect that, right? So that's why I'm advocating for more direct ways of sensing things. You still need to think of the privacy aspects of these things, but there are going to be trade-offs across all of these approaches. So now I'm going to change sort of the trajectory and like topic a bit and give you an example of some of the work we have done around behavioral sensing, because that is a bit more mature work, and I'll be able to show you examples where we have gone on the spectrum of like measuring, sharing, and explaining and helping people take care of themselves. And the first domain I'll briefly share is around depression in college students. I think all of us here are at a university. We know that depression is a huge problem across the whole globe. The average in the US is around 30%. In big top universities like Stanford, CMU, this number is even higher. And oftentimes students are confused between stress and depression. So we wanted to see if we could figure out a way to non-invasively measure depression. And we looked at signals that we can get from consumer devices like Fitbits, smartwatches, and phones. And we looked at these 6 sources of information, such as the sleep sensor, that because one of the symptoms for depression is trouble sleeping or sleeping too much. Step counts to look at fatigue and loss of energy. Physical locations that people have in for social interactions and fatigue, and overall different information that could provide us information about or insights into reduced social interactions. So we collected this data using Fitbits and smartwatches for 138 first-year students at CMU, college students. So, and we collected this data for the 16-week-long semester that we had at CMU, and we collected all this sensor data that I mentioned for the duration of these 16 weeks. At the beginning and at the end of the semester, we also did surveys that the psychiatrists do with their patients to check the starting depression levels that students had and their depression levels at the end of the semester. In our cohort, around 45% students showed depression symptoms. And unfortunately, no one got better throughout the semester. Some people stayed same, but most of them actually got worse, and that is the problem that universities are working on. So using this data, I'll go back. Sorry, one thing. Yeah.
Is that a common pattern over the course of the semester, and then does it tend to reset at the start of the next semester, or is that actually just sort of monotonic?
So I don't have a concrete answer given the data we had, because we only recorded this data for one semester. We did not do follow-up studies, but some of our colleagues who have done some studies around these symptoms say that they don't reset, but they sometimes reduce a bit and then they increase again. It's not a monotonic increase, but it's like a sawtooth with a general trend to increase. So using this data, we you can ignore the first week, the 0th week information. Using all this week's worth of data, we are trying to forecast whether this student will feel depressed or have depression symptoms at the end of the 16 weeks. So this is the result that we got. So with 1 week worth of information, we are like around 75% accurate, which could just be noise. But you can see as we get more and more data, we are more accurately able to predict that this student will have depression at the end of the semester. So we are forecasting. And by the middle of the semester, we are around 92% accurate, which is a great result, but then it drops. Does anyone know why that might happen? Any guesses?
Fall break.
Yes, so spring break. This was collected in spring. So it could be spring break, or it could be the midterms, because that happens in the 7th week. So basically, it's a sudden change in behavior. Due to exams or due to spring break, we don't know, but it's a sudden change in behavior that the algorithms did not know about. And we know in machine learning, garbage in is garbage out. Because the algorithm did not have information about the context of the user, it suddenly dropped and it almost never recovered from it.
Sorry, just another detailed question. Is it using cumulative data, or is it using only that week's data?
It's cumulative data. That's why you can see improvement, but then whatever noise was injected at around week 7 and 8, it never recovered from that.
And also it goes down in weeks 2 and 3.
Yeah, so I think that's just the noise in the signal. I think like initially it was overfitted. Or it could be that the behavior that, because the students reset, so it could be that the initial behavior was sort of like more descriptive of their overall behavior, like average behavior across the semester, but hard to tell.
And was this holding out students or holding out for
Holding
example,
out students.
I see. So you're training
like
it on.
5, yes.
I see.
Yeah, leave 5 students out at a time and averaged across all the folds. So overall, some of the observations that we had from this analysis was that the models are uncertain or are unaware of sudden changes that may happen in our lives. They don't generalize to similar populations. When you train a model on one set of population, let's say students at CMU, you try to apply that to students at University of Washington or Dartmouth. It does not generalize. In fact, the same model applied on next year's student at CMU also does not work that well. So the generalizability is a huge challenge here. It's still a challenge. I don't have a good answer to that yet. And how do we make this information actionable? So we need to do personalized interventions. We started some of that work, but this was around the time when COVID came and people's behavior were very different. So that was another reason why there was a sudden change in people's behavior, and the algorithms never recovered from that. We were looking at phone data, how the phone is moving, how many steps they are taking. No one was taking any steps during COVID. The phone was lying on the side table, right? So the algorithms did not work at all. And then there was a proposed solution by the reviewers that why not just ask the user that how they are feeling. And it's not a wrong, wrong suggestion. We actually tried that in our next study. And then beyond the college students, not everyone is like students. Student population is not same as general population. We all students take very similar classes. We have breaks at the same time. So the behaviors are very homogeneous for the most part. So to go for a more heterogeneous population, we started working with patients who have multiple sclerosis because one of the comorbidities for that is depression. And we collected similar data. In this case, we collected data for 12 weeks. Same sensor data. We got subjective questionnaires at the beginning and at the end of the study. But because the practitioner we were working with had trust that their patients will cooperate, we collected finer granularity ground truth information from these patients. And beyond that, every day, 3 times a day, we also asked them that on a scale of 1 to 5, simple question, how depressed do they feel, how fatigued do they feel? Because we wanted to see if this information is useful. We collected this data for more than 100 MS patients. 30% of these patients had some diagnosis for depression. They came from all walks of life, and they were in different age groups. So some of the challenges that were here is there is no common ground because they don't go to same classes. They also had varied timelines. They didn't start on the same day. It was a rolling sort of recruitment of these 100 patients. And the best results we could come up with was around 50 to 70%, which is much lower than what we had until then. This data was also collected during COVID. So when the stay-at-home period was there, that provided us with some common ground. So we anchored our data collection around the time when stay-at-home period began and when it ended, and used that as the anchor, that what happens to people's behavior before the period, during the period, and after. That helped. When we did that, so for example, here you can see that the number of locations people went suddenly went down, makes sense. Then it slowly recovered. And then the amount of time we were sleeping increased. And then slowly that, unfortunately, recovered as well. We are not sleeping as much as we used to sleep during the stay-at-home period. So overall, I won't go into detail, but all the measures that we recorded, the performance improved for that 55 to 70%. Now we had around like 80% results for almost all the measures. So that common ground helped. But still, that context is important, right? In this case, when the algorithm did not know what happened, the performance dropped. And I earlier mentioned that we'll do these EMAs and see if they help or not. Turns out not bad, not a lot. If you train a machine learning model on just asking or using data, if you just ask a person 3 times a day, we had great compliance. We had around 90% compliance. So almost 2.7 EMAs were responded every day by every patient. The correlation of the model that used this information provided by the patient was same as correlation with step counts. So just using Fitbit step count data is enough, it seems, than just asking this question. But overall, when you combine all the sources, the performance is slightly better. So this is without any EMAs. And then with EMAs, you can see slight improvement in all of the measures, but the statistically significant improvement only came for depression. And it turns out we don't need all the EMAs. Just 1 EMA a week was enough. After that, like the benefit just like tapered.
Think that I think intuitively you would think that if you ask somebody that it would be a much better signal than their step count. Do people not have a good sense of how depressed they're feeling, or is it the model can't use that information, or it's high variance? I'm just curious what you think.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of subjectivity. And when you ask someone how depressed they are, if that was useful, we would not have surveys that have 12 and 19 questions. You would just have that. The reasons doctor ask all those questions is because that gets to something much more meaningful. But you can't just keep asking again and again. There is an argument to be made that if we just give that 12 question survey, or 9, whatever, question surveys at different times in a week, it might work. But we haven't done that evaluation, that maybe, just ask one of those questions one day and another question next day, and when you collate that might be enough. So, but because there is a lot of concerns here, different populations will react differently. We are doing a lot of deployments of the system with college students in different universities, in teenage girls in schools, MS patients. We are continuing that with adolescents and also like cancer survivors. Because all these populations are going to bring up interesting challenges. So for example, with college students at different universities, we're also looking at different cultures. So the cultural norm at, let's say, Tsinghua is going to be very different from the cultural norm at CMU. So the population models will be very different as well.
I'm curious, I'm not an expert in mental health diagnosis. So just with depression, I'm curious, it's not like a sudden onset kind of issue. I'm curious, so then how does an algorithm, draw the separating hyperplane, so to speak? It's like, it seems like maybe you would need much more longitudinal data to even really have a chance at predicting this.
Yeah, I think we do need longitudinal data. With college students, it sort of works because they are continually getting worse in many cases. So there are things that trajectory sort of provides to the machine learning model. I'm sorry, I don't bring much good news here. Right? But for other populations, I think it is a bit of challenge. You do need more longitudinal data. That's why you'll see a lot of populations that we are working with is either students or people who have some illness, which is either they are recovering from it, so they are probably getting better, or in some cases getting worse. But for general population, it might be much, much harder problem. So a lot of this work where we are trying to figure out what people's behavior is, the backbone for the work we do is built on practical context and activity recognition models. And one of the models that we cheekily came up with was named Samosa, is sort of like part of some of the consumer devices as well at this point. We have used this for some of these data collection sort of efforts. And one, I'll go for a different domain, is around hyperactivity disorder in children. This is also a situation where the diagnosis, the management is very subjective. You have sparse information that the doctor is using. And here is a quote from a paper that came out of Canada a few years ago, that boys who were born in December were 30% more likely to receive a diagnosis of ADHD than boys born in January. And same thing is true for girls. Any guesses why that might happen?
Would it have to do with like the cutoff for what grade you get put into has to do with that, and then you're more mature within the
Exactly.
grade?
So when this data was collected, the cutoff in Canada was January. So the kids who were born in December are the oldest in the class, and the one in opposite. So it's just immaturity. So that highlights the subjectivity of the analysis of the diagnosis that the doctors do. So what we want to do is we don't want to replace the doctor. We want to provide them with a window in the lives, in the patient's lives, so that they can make a more informed decision. So we collected some data, and I'll show you data from two children. This is child A and child B. This is their motion pattern or amplitude of motion across 15 minutes of time. Both of the children were playing during this time, so they are physically active. The rest of the time, they were supposed to be reading, and you can say child A is still moving quite a bit. And they had ADHD, and the other child did not. This is obvious because we know they were reading and playing. Without that contextual knowledge, it is going to be really hard for someone to know what might be happening. So we used our model that we had built on the Apple Watch. And we basically removed the last layer and basically said that just predict, do you think the child is quiet right now or are they active? And we used this model, this basic model, combine that with the contextual information that the parents provided. At the end of every day, the parents provided us label of what they think the child was doing at a 30-minute interval. At the end of the day, because we didn't want to increase the burden on the parents. It would be very noisy, that information at 30-minute interval at the end of the day. But still that noisy information helped. When we included that in our model, across all the measures, with that contextual information that the parents provided, we did better on every measure, which tells us that the context can be helpful even if it is noisy. Same thing happened with depression symptoms, right? Step counts are inaccurate. Location indoors is very inaccurate, but still these signals provide some signal that is useful. But it's still not perfect. So we can't use it as a diagnosis. Even if it is perfect, we should not use it as a diagnosis. So we want to use it as a clinical decision support system. So we are working with doctors to figure out what that decision support should look like and how they can use it as a window into our lives to make the final decision. And it goes beyond just measurement of context and the amount of motion. You also want to see what kind of motion is it. I remember at the peak of COVID, there were photos people were posting that the child is hanging upside down from a table. That is very different than sitting at a table, right? So you want to know how they are moving. So you have built machine learning models that allow us to do that as well, using just commodity devices. So here is a video where the student has a phone in their pocket and a smartwatch, and we are identifying the pose that the person is making. Now, we initially built it for VR applications, but using the same algorithm with children who have ADHD diagnosis and see how they may move during the day, how they move between different classes can be really, really useful. So we want to sort of do this real-time human sensor AI collaboration. We need to add sensor information to make it more real-time to sort of start looking at specific contexts. It is also important to keep the user burden low here and identify moments of uncertainty and seek that user input from time to time. Another thing we want to do is, because we are seeking user input, we want to make sure that it is done at the right moment. So with the ADHD, children with ADHD, what we are trying to do right now is when the watch that they are wearing predicts that they are hyperactive, we want to send a notification to the parent to ask them that is the child hyperactive and get those labels in more real time so that they are less noisy. So we initially came up with this idea, and I shared this with my colleague with whom we are working, who's a pediatric psychiatrist, and he hated this idea. You know why? Because this keeps reminding parents about the negative times of the day. Many parents whose children have ADHD or other neurological symptoms or behavioral challenges have depression as well. So they said, instead of doing that, remind them of the positive moments. Ask them that I think the child is not hyperactive right now. If that is correct, go and praise the child. Do a positive intervention. So that can help the model, can help the parent, and also help the child. Right? So that's a benefit when you work with practitioners, you get these insights. So that's what we are trying to sort of use in our models right now.
Is there a reason for just the focus on hyperactivity type of ADHD versus the more general issue?
Two reasons. One is our collaborator is more interested in that. And second, physical hyperactivity is easier for us to measure using smartwatches. So those are really the two reasons. We really want to go beyond that, but because of these two, we have not yet.
Because distraction, you probably could sense in other ways.
Yes. The only thing is our collaborator says that there are already established ways where we can measure distraction. We can measure inattentiveness. There are tests that you can do. So that's why they are less interested. But I think from an intervention perspective, distraction and inattentiveness would be very interesting, but we have not gone there yet. So overall, across all of this work, what we are trying to do is figure out how to seek user input, what is the right time so that we can help them. So I'll show you one more example where we are working with skin cancer patients and trying to help them take care of themselves after surgery. So these are patients who have skin cancer, surgery is done somewhere on their face. It's called Mohs surgery. And after the surgery, they go back home, and for next 2 weeks, they have to take care of their wound. So during this time, they have to take care of their medication. They also have to take care of the wound, clean it, and everything. So it becomes challenging. They end up calling the doctor a lot. It's not super high stakes environment, but that is by design here, because we want to make sure as we recommend people what to do, how to take care of themselves. You don't go for situations that are super high stake because you don't want to do any harm. So that's why by design here we are working with a relatively less ill set of patients, and we are sort of building a context-aware assistant that can answer the queries that they have, can remind them about specific medicines that they have to take and how to take care of their wound. So we are developing this context-aware assistant where the family member or the patient can ask the assistant that might live on an ambient device or on a smartwatch that did I miss anything, and the agent can adaptively guide them through the process. So we did some initial data collection for that with approximately 150 cancer patients that came to the clinic. Before they had the surgery, they practiced through what it would look like. And we recorded all of that data. And they performed the skin cancer procedure on themselves to practice, gain some feedback from the nurse on exactly how to do the procedure. And it also provided training data for the machine learning models that how are they actually doing the procedure. So this is a win-win situation because before the study, the patients did not really get to role play what the procedure would look like at home. So their overall compliance, overall comfort level with the wound care also improved after the study. So we initially used that samosa model again to sort of see if we can detect what actions they are taking. Did they wash their hands? Did they apply the medicine or not? And the results were pretty bad because some of the motions that they were making were not as descriptive as what we might use in our research papers where we are hammering on screws or using drill machines or microwaves and things. So the accuracy was low. It was definitely not usable. We also tested it on a different task in our lab because we could get more people excited about coffee making than taking care of wounds. But then we used sort of the temporal nature of the process because you wash hands, then you wipe hands and all that. And when we use that temporal nature, the accuracy improves a bit, but still not a lot. So we now need to seek user input. So we established a way that we can have a dialogue with the user as they are doing the procedure that tell me when you do X being a specific step, or what are you doing right now? Are you doing this step right now? When we ask these questions, of course, the performance will improve, but the burden on the user will increase as well. ultimately, with this dialogue, you want to make sure that you are doing it at the important moments. But overall, you want to ask and guide the user. You want to observe and remind them. And you want to answer whatever questions they may come up with. So I won't go into the detail here, but what you are seeing here is this is over time on the x-axis. The y-axis is forecasted remaining time when the step that is supposed to happen at 600 seconds will happen. Because it's not just detecting what you are doing, it's also forecasting that this user is going to apply on a medicine on their wound at 600th second. So I need to make sure that I remind them in advance, because reminding them after they have bandaged themselves is not going to be super useful. So you have to forecast when they might do it. So initially you can see that the model has very low confidence, but something happened around 200 milliseconds that made the algorithm a bit more confident that this is going to happen around that time. So then they can start observing the person and reminding them of the specific step. The full disclosure, this is not from the cancer patient data. This is from the coffee machine task, because there again, we could collect much, much more data right now. The cancer patient study is still in progress. So overall, what we have been doing here is we take that context-aware assistant and we combine that with the background information that the doctor might provide to the patient to provide these three capabilities. And I'll show you a system of an end-to-end real-time human-AI collaboration system that has no camera data. All the information is coming just from the smartwatch and the dialogue between the system and the user as the user is making coffee.
What's next?
You can adjust the grind level.
Okay, the audio is not super loud.
Okay, what's next?
The knob on the left side of the machine.
I'll play that once again and I'll describe you what's happening. The user is going to ask, what am I supposed to do next? And the model has inferred that they have just started the procedure.
Okay, what's next?
Yeah.
You can adjust the grind level with the knob on the left side of the machine.
Because it is inferring that.
Yeah, what's next?
So they
After grinding beans, place a cup under the group head for brewing.
They have placed the cup, but they have
I
already
did
placed the
that.
cup.
What's next?
So I'm saying, no, I've already done that.
After
now that
placing the
information
cup,
is useful
press
for
the
the
start
model
button
because
to
now it
begin
knows
brewing.
that I can update my activity recognition model because I was wrong. I thought they have not placed the cup. So
Can
that's
you
feedback
tell me
for the
what you
model.
are doing?
I'm pouring milk to the espresso.
So the model can ask questions
Great.
themselves as well.
Next, you can wash the jar.
Gotcha.
So they reminded them to wash the chart because this user often
Make sure
forgets
to dump the grinds before washing the portafilter.
Gotcha. Thank you. Oh, I have done that. I'm washing the portafilter.
So you can't hear the user is saying, now I'm washing the portafilter.
Nice.
There was no need for them to
Washing
tell
off
that.
the jar
But
and
because now they have
portafilter,
established
you
a bit
can
of
enjoy your
relationship with
latte.
this agent, they know they help them. So whenever they feel comfortable and they remember, they just narrate as well. So with that, those self-narrations are good feedback loop for the model. And also in some cases, if you're doing a new task, when we keep self-narrating, we tend to remember things much more easily. So what happens is this collaboration helps both the user and the machine. So without any dialogue and with dialogue, you can see the tracking accuracy of the machine learning model is much better. And the nonsensical responses that the users get also get reduced. And as I said, this is for the coffee making task, but the data that we had collected with skin cancer patients in clinics, we don't have a solution yet because it's hard to build that machine learning model to identify what they are doing, but they are getting a lot of nonsensical responses from the large language models. We did a study where we took all of their questions and the background information that the doctor had given us and gave it to the model. And 50% of the responses that the LLM generated, different LLMs, we tested it across all 3 or 4 that were readily available. 50% of the responses were wrong, and 8 to 10% responses were medically harmful. So for example, in one case, the patient had dropped the gauze as they were cleaning the wound, and they asked, oh no, I dropped it, can I pick it up? And the model said, yeah, why not, go ahead. Now, of course, that is a wrong thing. So we are also looking at ways how we can have usable guardrails to build these systems and figure out. I know a lot of us are working on building these kind of things, but here we are trying to sort of apply it to a specific use case. And we are collecting this data with skin cancer patients, but because different populations will have different challenges, we are working with people with dementia as well. The videos and the data that I showed you today in this project relied a lot on human speech. People with dementia will not be able to speak that much. Their need for supports will be different, so you want to see what happens there. So overall, across all of this work that I had shown you today, we are doing a lot of deployments working with different populations because there are going to be different needs. The burdens we put on them will be different as well. But we need to utilize their domain knowledge, their context, and their intelligence as we build these systems, because 1 billion medical devices will also have 1 billion users. And as we test these systems with users in their daily lives, when they manage their health, we also need to ensure that we keep an eye on their agency and their privacy. For example, when working with people with dementia, you don't want to tell them, okay, now do this, now do this, now do that. That project that we have, it's called autonomous, because we want them to maintain their autonomy for as long as possible. Thank you. And these are my students who work with me across all of these different projects. With that, I'll end. Thank you.
Discussion, feedback, questions. I'm happy to kick it off. So, so Ivan Poporev has this whole vision now of sort of like unified sensor models. And sort of like, for him, it's like, why are we building, does 1 billion medical devices mean 1 billion different machine learning models? Mm-hmm. And I'm curious, like, one path toward the future you're trying to paint is that we have these multimodal language models now jointly embed sensor data so that I can say, count the number of times that, I breathe in and out or things like this, which in theory could really reduce the threshold to getting to, ad hoc sensors, maybe, at-home consumer-grade stuff. I'm curious, do you think that's a path forward, or do you feel like that is going to wind up sort of routing us the wrong direction?
So thinking more of a unified model that does this?
Unified models with a small number of sensors that have basically been pre-baked into that model, as opposed to, Ubicomp over the last, let's call it 10, 15 years has been very much about like, oh, here's a clever new sensor.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. So that's a great question. I feel one of the challenges is when we build unified models, they work very well, but they have a very long tail. And to build systems that do no harm is a very, very high bar for those systems. When we bake specific sensors, it is basically going to be the sensors that we have on a phone that will mimic human senses, or will be some slightly different sensors because those are the sensors for which we will have the data. Specific problems will require specific sensors, will require specific models. So I often say the machine learning models, we have to think of these as the electrical components that we have in a circuit. They all serve a purpose, and they all serve a very small purpose. We know what the input to that component of the electrical circuit is, and we know the expected output. Even if I don't know what is the chemical composition of that resistor, how is it working, but I know what to expect at the other end. I think that's what we need to do with these machine learning models as well, that we need to treat all of them as a very small decision maker, so that we can take things in and out that, okay, now for this case, I don't need RGB camera data, I need thermal data, right? So I think we need it to be slightly more specific.
So
but there are
moving away from the centralized models then.
Yes.
With the current progress on LLM and all that, will this actually make it easier to fine-tune specific machine learning models? Or will that make it actually more noisy in a way? So what's your view on that, and how does that work?
That's a great question. And I really don't have a very good answer right now. All I can say is that in our data as well, we have seen that happening. For example, when I said that the patient's questions were responded by sort of like 50% of the responses we got from the LLMs were wrong, was like the LLM of the previous generation. The latest models are slightly less inaccurate. So oftentimes when you try to publish these papers as well, reviewers are like, oh, but you did 3.0, now we have 4.0, or these things. So the long tail will always remain there, or will remain there for a long time, at least the way we are doing using these models right now. Providing evidence that it is there and it is harmful will become harder. And at some point, we'll become confident and we'll be like, you know what, yeah, we can now use it. But how do you stop those sort of like harmful cases to come up is going to be a bit of a hard challenge. So that's why you want to make sure that that we think about these problems and work on some of them, and maybe we'll have a solution. So for example, for the LLM one, we are right now trying to figure out ways to educate the doctors on how they can do prompt engineering. What data do they give to the model, that the model is only relevant to what this doctor believes in. And you keep updating the belief model of this clinic, because different doctors behave differently as well. So we are right now working on a system where they share the beliefs with different doctors, and how we read papers. They get a model that, okay, you know what, like this other dermatologist believes that a paracetamol works well for people who have allergy to brufen. Do you want to include this as a recommendation as well? Right? So you keep on building that information slowly, but you only rely on that information, and you make the model say that if it is not within that, just say, I don't know, and connect them to a human.
And just as a follow-up, I guess, in that example you just illustrate, it means that you're actually building a specific LLM or SLM or whatever inside, specific for that task. And as you build more cumulative data, you can actually trust that more.
Yes.
That way.
Yes.
Right. Yeah, thanks.
You mentioned that students often confuse stress with depression, and so was your model able to like disentangle that, and also like from the sensing data, like step behavior and stuff, can you disentangle that, or are they?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'll answer the second part first. I don't know if those sensors can really disentangle between stress and depression. Sometimes these models work uncomfortably better than what I thought they would. And I don't have a good answer there, because none of the models we have built are really explainable. When we say, okay, like this model works well, okay, what is the average behavior, for example, like what are some of the phenotypes? We can't get to that. So I don't know if these models are doing a great job at differentiating between those things. It's just that the way the questions are phrased as well in the surveys that the doctors give, the questionnaires that the doctors give, they also are not really geared towards differentiating between what stress and depression is. So we don't have a ground truth of who's stressed, who's depressed. So that's a challenge. One thing we are trying to do there is, instead of coming up with an output that aggregates to the aggregate of all the 12 questions that the doctors asked, can we try to estimate each of them individually, so that we can then talk to the patient that you said this on that day, that you are not walking too much. And the model is, of course, a step counter can tell whether you were physically active or not. So those are going to be obvious. But wherever you know that, okay, this question, I don't think this sensor can do a good job at this question. For that, maybe you seek more user input.
Thanks for your talk, Mayank. Sometimes the clinical labels that we use, like for depression or ADHD, are imperfect in themselves. And so sometimes, like when you fail to predict a label, it could be that you're measuring something important and different rather than getting something wrong. And so I'm curious to hear your thoughts on what you do in that scenario.
Yeah, that's a good question. So oftentimes those labels are going to be wrong. I don't have a generalized answer. I can give you an example. So when we worked with children with ADHD, our initial motivation was that many of these children are misdiagnosed. But then we used those diagnoses as a ground truth. So we did two things. One, we went for obviously bad cases as the hyperactive set that we had. Second, one of the reasons the misdiagnosis happens is because children get diagnosed by their primary care physician and they don't go to a psychiatrist. So we recruited 2 psychiatrists, we work with them, and they individually evaluated each child who was in our study. So we try to improve on the quality of the ground truth. But yes, it is a challenge in many of these cases.
I really like the example you gave of you had a hypothesis that flagging hyperactive things would be helpful, but it was what they actually wanted was totally against your intuitions. Do you have I guess, more examples around like where you had a strong hypothesis, but like for whatever reason, like user acceptability, or you had like totally a different way of thinking?
That's a good question. There is only one example that comes to my mind right now, but it's a flipped example for the same project, for the ADHD one. The doctors do not want a clinical decision support system. They want an answer. They say, just tell me whether this child is hyperactive or not. And I'm like, I can't do that. Right? So there as well, we are at odds with each other, but in the opposite direction.
I have one other. This is maybe just a speculation on the future. So one of the challenges of the quantified self movement was that, like, it was sort of like everyone thought that if we just had more information about, ourselves and our exercise, we'd make better decisions, we'd be fitter, healthier, like super. And in practice, that seems not to be true. Now, in the future you're building toward, I could have essentially continuous health monitoring. What would it take to get people, I guess, I see two possible futures there. One is it's equivalently ignored.
Yeah.
And the other is that there's cyberchondria, right? Where the thing is like, oh, you might possibly have this thing. I'm just curious, how do we design sort of like societal equilibrium around a world where now I can sort of test myself for many more things all the time, all this kind of stuff?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I was just talking with Parker about this, that behavior change is so hard that like you can't really, like the life cycle of a PhD student is not long enough to study whether a behavior change happened or not. So that's a really hard problem.
It's a slightly morbid way of putting it, but yes.
I think that has been themed today, right? I think...
life cycle like a butterfly.
Yeah. But the thing is, I lost my chain of thought there. Yeah. But yes.
Let's step by step.
Yes.
I think it's about. I'm curious for you because I think you've spent a lot more time thinking about this. Like, the obvious thing that I can see happening is that like there'll be this bifurcation toward a bunch of people who basically ignore it, and then a smaller set of people who become cyberchondriacs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Like, is there a way we can build toward a more well-informed middle ground?
Yeah, I don't have a good answer, but the challenge I think is also that you don't want everyone to be the same.
Yeah.
Right? When you say, okay, quantified self, take 10,000 steps, everyone would what's the ideal case? That all of us start taking 10,000 steps? That's not necessarily the only path to health and is not a guaranteed path to health. So how do you take care of that, right? So for example, the reason we started collecting depression data in different universities and different cultures for college students was because I presented this work and there was someone from Abu Dhabi, I think, NYU Abu Dhabi, and they said, like, you can't do this because you are going to generate same kind of interventions for all the students, and the students in Abu Dhabi are going to be very different from students there. So you also want to make sure that you are not just generating clones for the same people. So you have to figure out how to personalize it to individuals, to cultures. And what is it that goes beyond that change? Like, is that, like, do you really need the change, or maybe you want something else? Right? That behavior change is not the end goal, right? In every case. In some cases, we are also working on smaller duration period, like when people are recovering from injuries or surgeries. So there you are not necessarily trying to make a life change. You're trying to help them during that short term. The other thing we are trying to do is involve family members more. So, like, with the parents one is one example, but with depression as well, that if I get a notification on my watch that, stop washing your dishes and just go and sleep because sleep quality is more important, you can wash dishes in the morning. That is going to work, maybe some case, with me it will always work, but would not work with my wife. But imagine if I get the notification that pull your wife out of the kitchen, she needs to sleep. That might work better than she getting a notification, right? So we want to use that social fabric as well, that instead of delivering intervention to the person, can you deliver it to someone around them, that they have been binge eating, they have been eating by themselves, maybe go and have a dinner with them tomorrow, kind of thing. So that is sort of one direction. Again, that's not an answer, but an example how some of the problems can be alleviated.
Yeah, thank you. We are at time. Thank you.